Mission Atlantic, to ensure a sustainable future for the Atlantic Ocean. Integrated Ecosystem Assessment, or IEA, is a holistic approach to managing ecosystems by evaluating the cumulative impacts of natural variation and human activities. It follows an IEA loop that starts with scoping the system, together with stakeholders developing indicators, analysing the risks from and to different parts of the system, testing potential future scenarios under natural and anthropogenic change, and refine focuses on revising and improving the assessments based on the outcomes and insights gained from earlier stages in the cycle. This process helps balance trade-offs between ecological health, social well-being, and economic viability, ensuring sustainable use and conservation of ecosystem services. The initial phase is called scoping, which involves engaging with stakeholders to identify challenges to the system and to define objectives. This sets the foundation by outlining the study's scope, goals, and priorities to ensure relevance and targeted assessment. In this video, we zoom into the key component of the IEA's scoping step, stakeholder engagement. Our guide, Debbi, explains why stakeholders are at the foundation of IEAs, how to identify who should be invited to the table, and how to effectively engage with a variety of people with diverse experiences. Debbi also introduces some useful methods, tools, and approaches to use, while reiterating the importance of continued long-term engagement.
Hello, my name is Debbi Pedreschi and I work at the Marine Institute in Ireland, and I'm going to be talking to you about the scoping step of integrated ecosystem assessment on behalf of the Mission Atlantic project and why and how we engage stakeholders in this process. So integrated ecosystem assessment, or IEA, is a tool for ecosystem-based management, and it allows us to carry out integrated assessments of whole ecosystems. So not just individual species or habitats, but all of the species and habitats, how they interact with each other, through to the different environmental and human drivers that may be affecting these, such as industrial activities, but also take into account the benefits that we get from these marine environments in terms of ecosystem services, for example. And it's an attempt to look at the entire social and ecological system. IEA is an iterative process that involves a series of steps, and those steps are detailed in a number of other videos in this series, but today we're focusing on the scoping step, which is where we're trying to figure out what should be included in our assessment. So what are the management objectives that we are looking at? What are the human activities that should be included? What parts of the ecosystem? What scale are we operating at? So why work with stakeholders? Well, there are many reasons, but ultimately integrated ecosystem assessment is an applied approach, and thus it needs to answer a question or to address a need in order to be applied. So it helps us to understand real-world problems by talking to stakeholders and finding out what it is that they are struggling with. Therefore, it helps us to make our science more useful so that it can be applied in the real world. It helps us to include more and different types of knowledge, but also diverse perspectives, views, and needs. It helps us to understand the context in which we operate, which is critical to avoid things like unintended consequences. Also, knowing those different diverse perspectives, views, and needs helps us to identify and evaluate where trade-offs may exist. And this all helps to improve our work, but also helps us to be more fair, as in equitable, but also fair in terms of findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible, i.e. more transparent. And being more transparent and enabling more access to the process helps us to improve the acceptance of scientific data, the approaches and methods we use, and ultimately the decisions that may be based off of the science and the advice that we give. And of course, ecosystem-based management also demands that we include stakeholders in these processes. Ultimately, understanding the stakeholders involved does improve your understanding of the topic, but it's not just about the who, but it's also the why and the how that they are involved and engaged, and what may work in your context, which may not work in a different context. So it's about finding what are the appropriate responses and management actions and methods that are relevant to your region. So stakeholder identification is of course a key step. In order to engage with stakeholders, you have to know who you want to speak to. And there are many methods that exist for doing this, and we won't review them now. But who is relevant will depend on the scale that you're operating at. So for instance, it would be very different if you're looking at a small bay versus an entire ecoregion, and that will dictate the type and the level of stakeholders that you're able to engage with. It would also depend on what your questions are or what your needs are, and so where is this assessment coming from? Is this something that has been specified by a management agency already? Then it might be a case of they have a question that they want you to answer, and so who is relevant will depend on what that question is or what that area of interest is. The stakeholder group that you establish at the beginning will and should evolve as the IEA evolves. So as you get more information, as you include more stakeholders, you will get more idea as to who should be involved in the process. So it shouldn't be a fixed thing, it should be evolving as the IEA evolves and as more information comes in, and you can better assess who should be involved in the process. So the idea is to be inclusive as much as possible and get as many diverse perspectives around the table as possible. So one of the things that I mentioned you can do with these stakeholders is to start to identify what your questions are. This can be done very simply by simply asking questions. So the word cloud you can see at the top there is when we asked our Celtic Sea stakeholders what were their concerns for the region, and this word cloud is what resulted from it. But digging into it a bit deeper with them, we were able to identify specific scenarios or specific questions that they had for this region. In this case, they all centered around the environmental or ecosystem impacts of offshore renewable energy and the potential displacement of fishers due to offshore renewable energy and marine protected areas. Another tool that we often use is conceptual modelling, also known as mental modelling or mind mapping and so on. This is really a method for understanding. So either building consensus and shared understanding or understanding other people's perspective in a graphical way. So it is a graphical representation of a system. It will always be a simplified version of reality. That doesn't mean that it'll be simple, but it will be more simple than reality is. And it allows us to integrate different data and knowledge types and perspectives, and also for us to flag different concerns and interactions. And this can be done very simply with a bunch of post-it notes and scribbles, as you can see, or you can do it using an online tool such as Mental Modeler, which is freely available online, which is essentially just creating the boxes and the linkages between them, and you can dictate the strength of the interaction between them as well. And this we have done numerous times with our stakeholder groups for different purposes, but it really helps you to be able to identify what are your priority questions. It helps us to identify where the interactions occur, and it helps us to identify what are the critical components to those interactions or those questions. So you may hopefully be able to see that the different elements in this cover human activities and sectors that are acting on the marine environment, management measures that are influencing those interactions, pressures that are arising from those human activities, various ecosystem components of interest, but also socioeconomic aspects and ecosystem services. So it really helps us to see what the socio-ecological system around this particular topic looks like, and it helps us to flag areas for future research and development. Another tool or another approach that you can use with your stakeholders is to use your stakeholder group to ground truth what it is you want to do, or to ask questions, or to just make sure that you are including all the right elements. So as I said, one of the elements of the scoping is to identify what elements should be included in this assessment. So with our Celtic Sea case study, we took our list of sectors, our list of pressures, and the list of components, ecological components, to the stakeholders to ask them if there was anything missing, to have discussions around where this was included or where that was included, to make sure that we were accounting for everything. And also have discussions about whether the scale at which we were looking at the ecological components would be meaningful and be able to give us the kinds of outputs that we were looking for this assessment. You can then also ground truth your results with your stakeholders. In this case, after we had our final list of sectors, pressures and ecosystem components, we carried out a risk assessment exercise where we connected all of them together to identify the pressure pathways. So which sectors were creating which pressures and which ecosystem components were being affected by those pressures. Once these were identified, then each pressure pathway was assessed and scored. This allows us to compare them and rank them to identify which sectors or pressures are contributing the largest proportion of risk to the system. When this was done, we then brought the initial results back to the stakeholders for critical review and to check if the outcomes reflected their understanding of the system. If not, we discuss why not and determine if changes are needed to the assessment. And if changes are needed, we review and update the assessment accordingly. because ultimately it is very important that what we are doing is representative of the system so that we can provide appropriate ecosystem-based science and advice for management. To get the most out of your stakeholder engagement in integrated ecosystem assessment, it's really important that you do the work to identify what are the relevant avenues for inclusion of stakeholder knowledge or data or perspectives. Where can they have an influence on the work that you're doing? It's really important that you include multiple stakeholder engagement methods as appropriate to your goals for that engagement, and that there are multiple interactions. Engagement is an iterative process. It's not a one and done where you tick the box to say you've engaged with some stakeholders. Now, it needs to be a real engagement with meaningful opportunities for stakeholders to be able to engage or influence or even change and amend your work. It's also critical to manage expectations, and the best way to do this is to communicate clearly, openly, and honestly, especially about the limitations, whether they're down to resources or the limitations in the methods and the models, or whether it's communicating uncertainty around your outputs. It really helps to build trust, and once you have that trust established, you can have more meaningful and long-term engagement with your stakeholder groups. Of course, it's important to be adaptive and responsive. Remember, you're a human dealing with other humans, so expect the unexpected. Really critically, we need to recognize that facilitation is a very important skill, and it's very important to the success of our meetings and achieving our goals. Working with stakeholders means we need to be working in multidisciplinary teams with both social and ecological scientists working side by side. And again, critically, please follow up as promised. Make sure that this is a give and take two-way street. This is not about us just benefiting from stakeholder knowledge and perspectives and data, but also that we give back with our results and our outputs, and they can understand how it's been used. Ultimately, integrated ecosystem assessment is about meeting that need that is coming from the stakeholders. So let's make sure that we provide the feedback and outcomes back to them. So with that, thank you very much. I hope that has been somewhat informative for you, and do keep an eye out for the other videos in the series. Thank you.